Program Officer at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Bangkok, Thailand, specializing in the interlinkages between human rights, gender, and the environment. In this presentation, I will be introducing the framework for integrating rights and equality into disaster risk reduction, also known as the FIRE framework. This framework emerged from the partnership between RWI, the Stockholm Environment Institute, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency under the Regional Building Resilience through Inclusive Adaptive Disaster Risk Reduction in Asia-Pacific program, otherwise known as the DRR. In the next 12 minutes, I will address the questions: what is the FIRE framework, and how has this framework been used to support governments and civil society organizations in integrating human rights and equality into DRR policies and practice, whilst drawing from the insights and lessons of the DRR program. So, what is the FIRE framework and how did it come about? We are hearing repeatedly how climate change is the defining issue of our time, and how funding for disaster risk reduction is urgently needed to help the most vulnerable countries deal with the escalating climate shocks. Research has warned that 85% of the world's population, most of whom reside in the developing and least developed countries, has experienced extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. The majority of them are in Asia and the Pacific, which is home to approximately 4.3 billion people, and they are collectively bearing the heaviest burden. Many communities in the Asia-Pacific region are already experiencing more frequent occurrences of extreme weather conditions, rising sea levels, flooding, and other such climate-induced disasters. Thailand, my country of origin, is a case in point, as it has recently suffered from its worst floods in decades. Climate change and disasters adversely affect various human rights, especially those of the most marginalized in society. Disasters and climate shocks will exacerbate pre-existing inequalities and exclusion, which in turn render these groups even more vulnerable and exposed to future disasters and climate change risks. Besides the direct human rights impacts of climate change and disasters, measures that respond to these can also have negative human rights effects. Human rights-based and gender equality approaches, therefore, play a fundamental role in ensuring that the response to climate change and disasters is inclusive and equitable, and contributes to societal transformations that leave no one behind. The link between human rights, gender, disaster risk reduction, and climate change is also recognized in both the Paris Agreement and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction as guiding principles. Yet, when we look at these instruments, we don't get insights into how human rights and gender equality should be systematically incorporated into the DRR programs and policies to achieve transformative outcomes. Our experience under the DRR program underscores the importance of developing tools and guidelines that can help states to practically and systematically incorporate human rights and gender equality into existing operational approaches to DRR at all levels. In response, RWI and its partners developed the so-called FIRE framework, which consolidates already recognized human rights and gender equality standards and principles in this field. This was done without losing sight of the critical social norms and contexts that shape people's different exposures, vulnerabilities, and capabilities to respond to climate change and disasters. It offers practical guidance and tools on how states at national and subnational levels can systematically integrate human rights and gender equality in disaster risk reduction contexts. The FIRE framework, as you can see here behind me, comprises 6 dimensions. 1, participation and access to information. 2, non-discrimination. 3, fundamental rights and equality. 4, governance systems and structures. 5, agency and empowerment. And 6, social norms and context. A host of indicators derived from international standards and guidelines add depth to this framework. Essentially, the FIRE framework represents a systematization of a vast amount of learning and resources out there on human rights and gender equality in DRR. Rather than creating something new, the FIRE framework synthesizes existing guidelines, standards, good practices into a tool that is practical and effective for different actors. This then leads to my second question. How has this framework been developed and used to support governments and civil society organizations? Here I will highlight some of the tools and training courses we have developed using the FIRE framework. One tool is the actual consolidation of the standards and guidelines themselves. This document has been used in different kinds of contexts to support actors to conduct self-assessments on the extent to which existing human rights standards and guidelines are reflected in their country's national law and policy, as well as in their subnational practice and procedures. What you can see here on the screen are examples of using the FIRE framework's different dimensions, such as governance systems and structures, and fundamental rights and equality, and the consolidated standards that we draw from, for example, the interagency standing committee's operational guidelines on the protection of persons in situation of natural disasters. You can also see a reference to CEDAW's General Recommendation number 37 on the gender dimensions of climate change and DRR. And you can also see here at the top the IASC's guidelines on the protection of persons with disabilities in humanitarian contexts. Those are just 3 out of approximately 20 consolidated or standards that we have consolidated and have used in previously mentioned self-assessments for partners in different countries in the region. Here we have 2 consolidated standards to just give you an example or a flavor of what this means. Firstly, we have accessible, confidential, supportive, and effective mechanisms for all women wishing to report gender-based violence. Secondly, we have a consolidated standard on ensuring that persons with disabilities are fairly represented in camp governance mechanisms. The traffic lights represent the responses to a self-assessment form from practitioners who took part in the ATPC's regional training course on rights-based and inclusive approaches to early warning, evacuation, and camp management in 2021. Each number indicates the degree to which the participants deem these standards to be reflected in their national and subnational laws and policies. As for the second standard, on persons with disabilities being fairly represented in camp governance mechanisms, 63% of the participants responded that this has not been adequately incorporated into their national disaster risk reduction and law and practice. Using the FIRE framework helps bring a wide range of human rights and gender equality standards and guidelines to the fore, many of which would otherwise have been overlooked or addressed only in a cursory manner. Also, we have developed a range of training materials, including a manual, which is available on RWI's website, consisting of scenarios and case studies, as well as mechanisms for peer-to-peer learning on rights-based and inclusive approaches to early warning, evacuation, and camp management. A final tool is the legal analytical tool that integrates questions emerging from the FIRE framework We have applied it to, amongst many contexts, the Philippines Comprehensive Land Use Planning Guideline. I don't want to say much about our findings and recommendations in that context, as this work is still ongoing. However, it has certainly proven an effective tool for identifying areas of improvement in integrating the FIRE framework's 6 dimensions into land use planning. So what do we do from here? Well, based on what I've said and our 5 years experience in the region under the BRDR program, 4 things are clear. Firstly, human rights and gender equality are integral to disaster risk reduction. We know that from the Sendai framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. We have also seen from the work that we have done in the last 5 years that integrating these perspectives highlight aspects that are essential to achieving the SDG commitment of leaving no one behind. Secondly, what we have also found in the responses to the self-assessment tool is that DRR practitioners at all levels already integrate aspects of human rights and gender equality into law and policy to some degree. Thirdly, the FIRE framework supports the systematic integration of rights and equality using a multi-level and a multi-stakeholder approach. Finally, we can see that there is a need to continue testing and refining this framework in different disaster risk reduction contexts and countries. Now, to learn more about the FIRE framework and about our work in general in the region, please do visit RWI's social media platforms as well as website, where we have a plethora of resources for you to read. You can also visit our table there behind you to your right, where we also have resource materials for your reference. With this, I would like to thank all of you for your kind attention, and I wish you all a successful and a productive conference. Thank you so much.